Hello, my name is James Oldroyd from International Hub. My guest today is Rajshree Agarwal, who is the Rudolph P. Lamone Chair and Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Maryland and the Director of the Ed Snyder Center for Entrepreneurship. Her research looks at the evolution of industries and firms and how this impacts entrepreneurship.
When we're thinking about innovation, new to the world innovation, we tend to have two stereotypical notions based on both the way the world used to work as well as our theories that have studied the phenomena. One is that most new to the world innovations, brand new industries, they tend to originate from the developed countries and then they diffuse to the developing countries. This is what we call the traditional north-south diffusion model, also called trickle-down innovation. Now, of course, what happens in those situations is that these innovations then cater to the needs, which are primarily for the developed countries, and then the trickle-down happens to the extent that the same needs are common between the developing and the developed countries. So that's one phenomena / theoretical wisdom that has come down for the last 40, 50 years. The second one is, but in the recent 20 or 30 years, we are seeing this phenomena of trickle-up innovation or trickle-sideways innovation, where you have some of these innovations that are occurring in the developing world, and in fact, then they find their way up to the developed world too. Or, with the increase in globalization, the innovation starts in a developing country and goes to another developing country, completely bypassing it. And while this is promising for the first issue, the heroes in these stories are the multinationals. That it is the multinationals, largely some of them utilizing innovation from the developed country, adapting it into the developing countries, and then bringing it back. Or the multinationals are largely based from the developed country themselves, so they're the saviors, if you will. Doing this study in the global mobile money industry, one of the heartening things to see is that that's actually quite not the case. Yes, it's true that multinationals, particularly mobile operators, do see an opportunity, particularly in the developing world. Things that we don't see in the United States because, we're used to financial institutions. We all have a bank. 80% of the developing world population at one point in time was completely unbanked, and they still are unbanked. So the mobile operators in these countries, because they already had this well-established technology, saw an opportunity for them to develop mobile money, which is literally person-to-person payment using airtime minutes. And if you were to believe even today's popular press, M-Pesa from Kenya is considered to be the huge success story introduced by a multinational, Vodafone, in conjunction to developing technology with another UK firm, Sagentia. But if you look at all of the pioneers, not just M-Pesa. M-Pesa actually was introduced in 2007. The first mobile money platform was actually introduced in 1997. And between 1997 and 2007, you actually had 31 firms create 20 platforms for the first time in these countries. So these are all parallel efforts. And what we end up seeing is a very fundamentally different phenomena than those two received wisdoms. One, you notice that these are innovations that are born global. So it's not stemming from the developed world and then trickling down. It occurs both in developed and developing countries, but because of the unmet needs being more salient in developing countries, it really takes off in the developing country. And the other thing that's very interesting is, yes, the multinationals did matter in global expansion and international diffusion of the mobile platforms across other countries that were suitable. But by far, the outsize effect is because of developing country startups So by all theoretical accounts, these developing country startups have a double disadvantage. They lack the resources and capabilities of an established firm, and they do not have the multinational presence already to go into other countries. So they have size, scope, location disadvantages right off the bat. But what we end up seeing with them is that these constraints are itself transformed into opportunities. So these developing country startups, we call them David twos, because there are also some developed country startups. But relative to both the Goliaths, the multinationals, or the developed country startups, the David twos are the ones that really have an outsized influence on all of the diffusion in mobile money. And the reason they do that is because they focus their efforts on the upfront technology, and they very actively partner with the mobile operators in both the first country of launch, but also in subsequent ones. Whereas the multinationals, they're actually constrained by the fact that they only have these presence in a limited number of countries. And they look at other mobile operators as competitors. So they don't ally with them on this particular business unit. And so you end up seeing that these David twos are not only able to leverage their technology, but they very actively develop capabilities so they can work across different countries with different partners, access the cultural and locational dissimilarities. They will rely that on their partner, but they will focus on how well to work with the partner and how to take that technology and make it work in this new country circumstance. These born global industries tend to be digital too. So in some ways, they don't have this high size requirements. And these startups can now take advantage of their nimbleness, their flexibility, and be able to really have an international presence. As far as grant writing and getting grants is concerned, I think I cut my teeth very early with, even during my PhD training, in terms of thinking about what resources do I need in order to conduct deep data development. A lot of the data that I collect for the studies that I do are not canned data sets that I can just simply get that are publicly available. They were data that I had to create. And so resources became a very big issue even as a PhD student. And what I was fortunate enough to do is start applying for small grants, even within the institution, right off the bat. And so I became very used to writing these grants for smaller institutional grants, inter-university research grants that you would get, for summer grants once I became a professor. And one of the early routines that I learned is that I was never going to write a grant for research that I wasn't going to do anyway. So the question is not, if I get the money, then I will do it. It's really a question of bricolage. How am I going to assemble the resources that I need to do in order to do the work that I'm going to do, regardless of how I get the money? The second thing is that also enabled me to actually use these grant applications as ways to further my research agenda. So, it was not work that was going to be wasted, that if the application didn't come through, then I was not going to be able to write a research project, paper out of it. Because many of the things that we need is actually in terms of data purchase, yes, but those are largely modest. They come largely in the context of PhD student, undergraduate, RA time, my own time that I can dedicate and put aside for it. That's what social sciences research is really about. It's not about buying big equipment and big computers and so on. So it was easy for me to think through the grant application process and just embed it within the research enterprise itself. And then I started to become a little bit more ambitious. Of course, the first several times that I applied for an NSF grant as an assistant professor, I had 0% success. In fact, tried again. And my first NSF grant did not come for a good 15 years since my first application. So story number one is there is a very small chance of success, but that doesn't mean that if you don't apply, there's a 0% chance of success, right? But if you reduce the costs of grant application anyway, then it works out. Now, for public foundation grants, such as NSF, one of the suggestions I would have for scholars that are thinking about it is that the grant is being reviewed by a panel of scholars. And what they want to do is see signals of whether you can credibly commit or complete the goals of the research that you're doing. So paradoxically, this means that you apply for the grant halfway through the research project as opposed to at the front end of the research project. So you can at least show some preliminary results and increase your credibility. And one of the things that, of course, I've done, because all of my research projects tend to be connected to the earlier path-dependent research questions that I'm interested in, is I often leverage the foundation grant for completing the other half of this project and then seeding the second application that I would be getting at. So that's a strategy that has worked for me as far as public foundations are concerned. Now, I make this distinction because applying for an NSF foundation is a very different process than applying for, say, a Kauffman Foundation process or a Rockefeller Foundation one. At least when I received my first grants from Kauffman Foundation, I'm grateful for immensely, because they helped define not only my own research agenda, but also my students and my junior colleagues. They had a process where they were betting on the scholar and not necessarily on the idea. So in NSF, in fact, it's double-blinded review. They don't, as far as possible, they want to focus on the content of the particular proposal rather than the people that are doing it. Kauffman and the private foundations tend to say, we don't know about whether or not this idea will come to fruition or not, but we want to bet on the person. So with Kauffman Foundation, with Rockefeller Foundation, it was very important for me to establish right up front the trust and the credibility that, in fact, I am going to be able to deliver on high quality research. Don't do what you weren't already thinking of doing. And that reduces that sense of ickiness that one also gets about, am I doing this research in order to get the grant and benefit from it otherwise? So look for the synergies. So focus on research interests that fascinates you, and then identify where are the grant opportunities that might suit and align and fit with your own research. That's thing number one. Thing number two, during the process of research, make sure that you build that in so that you use the grants as interim deadlines to keep yourself accountable to keep the research going. And thing number three, distinguish, know your audience. So know whom you're applying to, what processes they use. And I'd be surprised as to how many young scholars don't think of picking up the phone and calling the program director. I have always found program directors very willing to talk to you, give you honest feedback. Yes, it fits. Yes, it doesn't. No, it doesn't fit. And yes, here are the ways in which what you're doing would really align with us. When Kauffman Foundation had first started, they had created what was called the Kauffman campuses as the first way in which they engaged with university research on entrepreneurship. And so one of the colleagues at University of Illinois had received this Kauffman Campus grant, and Paul Magelli, was benevolent enough and kind enough to introduce me to Bob Lighton and Bob Strom and discuss the fact that my research had a lot of promise with them. And so what they asked me to do was kind of create a proposal that I would submit to them. And then once they read the proposal, they invited me over and spend a good day and a half talking with me, assessing credibility and signals, assessing alignment and fit. And then after that, they gave me the grant. Since then, they have done a more open call for proposals. And of course, they're very actively present at the Academy of Management, at the American Association, ASSA meetings. So they've done a lot of outreach. And of course, in the last 20 years, there has been a very robust set of us researchers that have benefited from Kauffman Foundation support and are now willing to pay it forward to create a community. Rockefeller Foundation, too, it's very similar in that if they reach out to you, in fact, the people that are leading their research efforts were very proactive in identifying who are the top scholars that they can learn from. In the Rockefeller Foundation grants that I received, one of my co-authors, whom I'd been working with, was very, very good in this post-harvest loss issue that Rockefeller Foundation was interested in. And so they connected with him, and Steve Sonka then brought me on board because of the synergies and the complementarity.